Good evening. I'm Dave Radcliffe. I'm chairman of History and Archives here at the church. And we'd like to welcome you all. We're really pleased to have you here. We're also very proud of this beautiful structure that you're going to hear about tonight. It's a wonderful place to have as your home for worship. And the men that you're going to hear about tonight were very instrumental in making this possible. I know you've got a lot to cover, and I'm going to turn this over to Dennis Johnson, who is the program director for Lake Forest Preservation Foundation. Okay.
Well, the good speakers are yet to come. Thank you, David. Good evening, everyone. I'm Dennis Johnston, and as David said, I'm the program director of the Lake Forest Preservation Foundation. And on behalf of the foundation and our president, Suzanne Boren, I would like to welcome you to this wonderful event. And you know, the classic setting, the First Presbyterian Church. This opportunity was brought to our attention by Dr. Arthur Miller, the archivist at the Lake Forest College. Art is a good friend, a fellow board member, and an individual who possesses a really deep encyclopedic knowledge of the historic structures of our city. Art has written and published extensively on the architectural history of the North Shore. This is really his passion. So when Art recommends another writer, as he has Ted Wolner, we're interested in his work. For that reason, I am pleased to welcome Art Miller to the stand to introduce our featured speaker. Thank you very much.
Hello. I'm going to be introducing Ted in just a minute, and just wanted to briefly point out that locally there are quite a few Henry Ives Cobb designed buildings, some in partnership with Charles S. Frost, and some on his own. Across the street here at Lake Forest College, there is, you're going to hear about in a little bit, Durand Institute and a gymnasium that was built, now Hotchkiss Hall. There are a few houses right clustered here around the church that reflect different styles, Tudor, shingle style, that sort of thing. And then on Green Bay Road, there were some houses built. One that's a kind of a Georgian colonial, almost kind of a Southern colonial house, and another one that's a similar Georgian, but a little more upright house. A couple of places have also been turned, 2 or 3 places in town, I think, have been turned into residences that were formerly stables. One was for the Ralston House that was across the street. There's a stable that's been adaptively reused. There is the stable at 500 North Green Bay Road for that house that was the David B. Jones place, and most especially there's the adaptively reused Ferry Hall Chapel, which is a great saving for the community on Mayflower Road, which we're going to see later. And so there is a context of these buildings here in town that helps us to see what his work is here, but then what we need a much bigger picture of is what's going to be where Cobb's work is on a larger stage that takes us from Boston to Chicago to Washington and New York. So we're going to see a very large story based on someone who lived here and was part of our community for a while. Edward Wolner is a professor in both the architecture departments and the humanities departments at Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana. And he has worked for 5 years on this book. has spent a good deal of time right here in Lake Forest and in many other research repositories around the country, and has turned up a great deal of new information we just didn't have before. So it's a great pleasure for me to introduce to you now Mr. Wolner.
Good evening. Thanks for coming out in such large numbers and for joining me in this talk in a terrific building. This is a church I love. I was speaking with Franz just before the introductions and remarking that this is the only shingle-style church I know of in America. And given how shingle-style houses exploited very sweeping, large gables, there couldn't be another building type more appropriate to a large sweeping gable than a church. This is certainly an extremely handsome structure, and I'm really happy to be giving this talk in a building designed by Cobb. I just want to take 30 or 35 minutes to give you some of the highlights of my research and analysis of this exceptional man's very exceptional career. So I'm just going to hit on the 8 or 9 themes that weave themselves through the 12 chapters of the book. And they're organized around the idea that Henry Ives Cobb is Chicago's other major 19th century architect. That is, his buildings filled an institutional void that architects giants like Frank Lloyd Wright, Louis Sullivan, John Wellborn Root, and Daniel Hudson Burnham did not. Unlike their largely residential and commercial practice, Cobb designed almost all of the city's major cultural and civic institutions, as well as designing scores of houses. These projects did more to address criticism that Chicago was excessively materialistic than any other enterprises in the city, excepting only Adler and Sullivan's Auditorium and Charles Hutchinson's Art Institute. Like those two institutions, Cobb's civic and cultural institutions expressed the highest ambitions the city had in the realms of culture, intellect, and urban development. Cobb's career had a unique, multifaceted significance for Chicago's development in the 1880s, 1890s, and the first decade of the 20th century. A significance that was at once urban, social, cultural, and architectural in nature. There were at least 9 aspects to it. First, Cobb's patrons or clients showed how projects initiated in Chicago's pre-fire generation, roughly 1835 to 1871, seeded much of the city's cultural and metropolitan maturation in its post-fire period, about 1872 to 1910 or so. So, for example, you see in this map a fairly close-up view of the near north side of Chicago. Essentially, the near north side of Chicago was the creation of real estate speculators and developers William Butler Ogden and Walter Newberry. They founded institutions like the Chicago Historical Society, the Newberry Library, and the First University of Chicago. Cobb designed all of those institutions in the second generation of Chicago's development. Pre-fire city builder Potter Palmer was Chicago's Baron Eugene Haussmann, literally. That's not a journalist's hyperbole. Palmer invented high-end retailing in Chicago, and he gave other men, other self-makers like Marshall Field and Levi Leider, their first big retail opportunities. Palmer invented State Street retailing before the fire. You see that State Street represented in the upper left. And he reinvented State Street retailing after the fire. You see that State Street in the upper right. He also, of course, subsequently developed Lakeshore Drive, which you see in the large photograph after the 1871 fire, the neighborhood that is now the Gold Coast. And that development gave Cobb major opportunities to design mansions, townhomes, and freestanding houses for middle class, upper middle class, and wealthy clients. And you see some of Chicago, some of Cobb's houses for various, for clients of various levels of wealth, indicated by the black rectangles on that map. And of course, the single most famous residential commission in the Gold Coast was the house for Potter and Bertha Palmer, which he designed in 1882 on the drive itself. The pre-fire Chicago Astronomical Society laid the institutional groundwork and provided one of the 3 telescopes for the later Yerkes Observatory that you see in this photograph, another of Cobb's major cultural commissions. The pre-fire real estate fortune of Ferdinand Peck's father seeded the son's experiments with new forms of financing at the Chicago Opera House, designed by Cobb and Frost, on the left, a venue that serviced both high and popular culture events. And the Chicago Opera House, in turn, functioned as an experiment by Peck that led to his later development of the auditorium, which of course was a venue almost exclusively in 1889 and 1890 for high culture events, operatic and symphonic music events, along with certain political conventions. More inadvertently, graft and corruption in the handling of construction contracts for the pre-war city and county building, upper right, and of contracts for the pre-fire federal building, lower left, led to the rapid deterioration of both buildings and opened the way for Cobb's campaigns to become the architect for new, innovative versions of both institutions, upper left and lower right. The second theme that weaves itself through the book has to do with how Cobb's buildings embodied a certain kind of civic humanism, a humanism that enabled Chicago to create a range of elite and democratic institutions not true of other cities like Boston, New York, or Philadelphia. By civic humanism, I'm referring to cultural activities and institutions undertaken through local initiatives at a time when, say, Shakespearean plays and the developing sciences were subjects avidly explored not just by brainy elites, but by the broad mass of city populations. So William Rainey Harper established and Cobb designed a university whose undergraduate and graduate standards of admission were for the brainy elite, but the university's extension division allowed working men and working women to study in the evening. Its correspondence division allowed anyone anywhere in the country to take the university's courses, and its sociology departments had faculty and students study the lives of the poor and collaborate with social reformers like Jane Addams. The University of Chicago was among the very first institutions of higher education to admit women along with men, and a leader in the development of dormitory accommodations for the women. A third theme that weaves itself through the book has to do with Chicago as the nation's center for self-made individuals. Given the kind of laissez-faire capitalism and the architectural institutional opportunities opened up in this city by the 1871 fire. So rich was Chicago in self-made men and women who rose from indigent or humble beginnings that Cobb's clients actually represent a nearly complete typology or spectrum of self-makers. I'll give you some examples of the different types. Let's say the literary businessman. Eliphalet Blatchford was a manufacturer of lead products. He was an educational reformer. He founded a Working Man's Improvement Association. He had perhaps the finest private library in the city, at least before 1880, and he was the leading trustee of the Newberry Library and the man who conducted an extraordinarily painstaking search for its architect, finally settling on Cobb. Another kind of self-maker I call the creative entrepreneur. Potter Palmer would be Exhibit A. So would Clement Studebaker, the nation's preeminent designer and manufacturer of the wagons that made pioneer migration, farm labor, and municipal maintenance possible in the middle of the 19th century. Cobb designed a mansion for him in South Bend, Indiana, that was larger and just as costly as the Palmer Mansion. Another type one might refer to as the captain of solvency. Ransom Cable was not a creative entrepreneur, but this poor boy from the state of Ohio successfully managed the railroad lines established by the likes of William Ogden, and merged several of Ogden's lines, in fact, to form the Northwestern Railroad Company. Cable commissioned Cobb for a townhouse on the near north side that was one of Cobb's most original essays in the Romanesque idiom. Among self-makers, there are also unscrupulous manipulators. Streetcar magnate Charles Tyson Yerkes is the best example in Chicago, at least in the late 19th century. And it was he who put up all the money for the Yerkes Observatory, and he who succumbed to Cobb's sales pitch to do a full-blown observatory with not just one but 3 telescopes and a set of astronomical equipment that made it the most avant-garde observatory really in the world. The University of Chicago also brings together, among the group of people who donated money, a whole set of educational and political reformers, William Rainey Harper being the first among them. Helen Culver and Charles Gerald Hull were also philanthropists, educational reformers, advocates for property and home loans to be made available to working class families, including ex-slaves. And it was their money that financed Hull Court at the University of Chicago, which many of you know as the north central quadrangle in Cobb's plan that houses most of the sciences that then populated the university. You're looking at different photographs of the botany building, including an interior view of the greenhouse located in the roof section of the building. Another kind of self-made individual I call rich scions of self-made men, individuals who became cultural entrepreneurs. They were not from humble or indigent backgrounds, but given Chicago's pervasive ethos of self-making, they refused to live lives of leisure, as many scions did elsewhere, and instead made themselves over in the nation's most receptive city for individual initiative. The standout example here might be Bertha Palmer. Like Alva Vanderbilt in New York and Helen Stewart Gardner in Boston, Palmer was a society queen, a fashion plate, and a beauty. But unlike them, she was also a political reformer who advocated for improvements in housing and working conditions of women employed in factories. She visited these tenements and these factories. She invited these women to discussion groups held at her mansion in spaces such as the ones you see in these photographs. She pushed constantly for women's rights, publicly and often. And she was the individual most responsible for the appearance of the Women's Temple at the World's Fair. Cobb himself is also an example of the rich scion as a self-maker. He was from a family of Boston Brahmins, grew up in Brookline, than which there is no more Tony, a suburb in Boston, or so it was in the middle of the 19th century. Cobb moved to Chicago in 1881, and here he discovered that it was possible to rise farther and faster as an architect than he would have been able to in Boston or New York, where traditions about how swiftly one got ahead would have held him back longer. Cobb was not only an exceptionally accomplished architect at an exceptionally young age, he was also an entrepreneur for some of the city's best-known institutions, that is, the entrepreneur as well as the architect for what literally became the nation's finest athletic club, the Chicago Athletic Association that you see in the photograph on the right. And he was one of the founders, as well as the architect, for one of the metropolitan region's finest country clubs, that is the Anwensia Club. Louis Sullivan, in his autobiography of an Idea, famously remarked that it was Daniel Burnham, as an architect, who first discovered the possibilities of practicing architecture in a new way. Burnham, Sullivan maintained, developed the bureaucratic architectural firm. He moved architectural practice out of the studio or the atelier, a relatively small sort of arrangement in which 5 or 6 architects turned out all of the firm's work, and instead created a bureaucratic model for the practice of architecture, involving, let's say, a score or more of draftsmen, 10 or a dozen architects, secretaries, a bookkeeper, a whole bureaucratic division of labor. Sullivan failed to notice that Cobb was doing exactly the same thing at exactly the same time that Burnham was. In fact, in 1893, Cobb's firm was considerably larger than Burnham's and larger than Halliburton Roach's, another firm in town that was also moving from the studio or atelier model to the bureaucratic model of practice. So another way in which Cobb is entrepreneur as well as architect, in which this rich scion of a Boston Brahmin family makes himself over, becomes a kind of self-made man in Chicago. Another theme that weaves itself through the book has to do with Cobb's varieties of the Romanesque. Between 1880 and 1893, this architectural idiom defined Chicago to Chicagoans and to the rest of the country to a much greater extent than was true of the Romanesque buildings in other cities like Boston, New York, Cincinnati. There were more architects practicing it more creatively in Chicago than architects elsewhere, and Cobb was using more creative variations on the Romanesque than perhaps any other Chicago architect. And by creativity in the Romanesque, I'm referring to plans, facades, material selection. Cobb was a real Ruskinian. That he believed in a sensual architecture, an architecture that exploited the possibilities of color, of texture, of pattern. There's an excellent example of this right across the street in the form of the Durand Art Institute. In these photographs, you see Cobb's creative fusion of the Queen Anne and the Richardsonian Romanesque at the Cable House, lower right, and the Union Club, upper right. The brownstone, a New England brownstone, was used on the walls of the Union Club, and a Minnesota honey gold Casota stone was used on the Cable House. Sorry, I don't have color photographs to illustrate the sensuous properties of the material. Cobb could also work in a very stripped down, simplified, almost abstract sort of Romanesque, as he did when he designed the Chicago Opera House in 1885. Photograph's a little dark for you to see just how stripped down it is, but please take my word for it. There's also the classical Romanesque that he developed for the Newberry Library and for the Yerkes Observatory. On top of that, there's the monastic Romanesque of the Fisheries Building at the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. That is a Romanesque creatively adapted for the functions of displaying fisheries exhibits from around the world, and whose forms and vocabulary come, of course, from the Romanesque period of Western architectural development around 1100 or so. There's the straight ahead, or more or less pure Richardsonian Romanesque of the Durand Art Institute, whose plan and central elevation draw significantly on H.H. Richardson's Billings Library at the University of Vermont. You see it in the top photograph. Then there's the entirely original Romanesque of the Chicago Historical Society. And I really don't know of another Romanesque building in this country at this particular time in history that exhibits this kind of, well, it's really an independence of H.H. Richardson. It's clearly Romanesque, but I certainly wouldn't call it Richardsonian Romanesque. I'd call it Cobbsian Romanesque. I'd also like to emphasize in Cobb's creative varieties of the Romanesque the fertile ornamental imagination that informs all these and his other non-Romanesque buildings as well. So here you're looking at a detail of the Cable House porch with rather extraordinary naturalistic ornament. And the ornament in the concentric arches for the three-arched entrance to the Newberry Library is an equally virtuoso performance. The fishy forms that crawl all over the column shafts, the column capitals, and the arches for the fisheries building at the fair were one of the reasons that made the fisheries building the single most popular, the single most visited, and the single most positively reviewed work of architecture at the fair, whether the critics were American or European. And then, of course, there is the frieze for the Durand Art Institute. I'm sorry, you can't see just how intricate and subtle a lot of those naturalistic curvatures are because of the darkness of the projection. But both the frieze and the concentric arches are quite wonderful. The single best photograph I've seen of that entrance, I think, is in the book that Art and Franz did on Lake Forest. Wonderful book, helped me a lot. Speaking of getting lots of help, Art made my research here in Lake Forest so easy, so efficient, and so productive. I'm really in debt to him. And both Art and Franz proofed carefully the Lake Forest sections of the book. And here you see just a hint of Cobb's ornamental virtuosity at the Yerkes Observatory. There's a very charming and compelling iconography or symbolic program for the observatory that involves allusions to the science, the burgeoning, the embryonic science of astronomy, including witty plays on the signs of the zodiac and those sorts of things. Examples of his ornament at the University of Chicago in the Gothic rather than the Romanesque mode. Budgets were constrained, so the ornaments concentrated along roof lines and around entrances to buildings like the Kent Chemistry Building in the upper right-hand photograph. I give over 2 chapters of the book to Cobb's very interesting work in the commercial architecture of skyscrapers. He wasn't only a residential architect. He wasn't only an architect of civic and cultural institutions. And I show you on the left the Owings building, and I put it up against the Tacoma building by Halliburd and Roach to show you just how experimental this particular period in the history of the development of the skyscraper actually was. The year is 1888 for both buildings, and both buildings demonstrate the rigor with which their developers and their architects pursued maximum profit for the developer or the owner. And each building demonstrates a very different way to max out profit. For the Tacoma building, profit is maximized by maximizing floor space, and floor space is maximized by literally extending out into the air all of those bay windows that you see, which significantly increases the floor space and returns to the owner that much more rental income. The Owings building takes a very different sort of approach. It's on, or was on, a much more prominent site, a very busy corner site right across the street from the first federal building. And Cobb, according to the wishes of the owner, designed the building in a deliberately picturesque manner, which is to say, he employed the unusual features of Queen Anne gables on both street sides of the building, the very prominent corner turret, and he designed the chimney over there on the right to be a kind of turret echo to its larger cousin on the corner. So the idea here was to create a compelling, picturesque silhouette that would heighten the identity of the building, its owner, and presumably the prestige of the tenants who rented office space in it. So this became, too, a way in which to maximize profit for the owner. And in designing the Owings building in 1888, Cobb literally invented the gabled skyscraper. And he used gables not only in the upper portions of the building, but also over the entrance, and maybe here you get some sense of the intricacy and the virtuosity of the ornamental design Cobb was capable of. But no sooner had Cobb developed the Owings building than other firms like Burnham and Root began to capitalize on the standout profiles possible with gabled skyscrapers. So Burnham and Root's Masonic Temple, which included Masonic parlors under the gables, and Burnham and Root's Woman's Temple also exploit the gable as a way of setting off, enhancing the identity of the building. Another theme that runs through the book is Cobb's role as an actor in the specialization and elaboration of professional and social life in the late 19th century metropolis. Cobb was an early leader in dividing labor in building construction. The Union Club, 1881, is an example. Cobb was the chief designer. He brought in Charles Frost from the Boston firm of Peabody and Stearns to prepare detailed construction drawings and supervise from the architectural point of view the actual construction of the building. Cobb also brought in from Peabody and Stearns in Boston another architect who served as the contractor, the actual builder of the building itself. And he brought in another independent designer to do the interiors of the Union Club. So this was a very early example on a relatively modest scale of the increasing divisions of labor that began to crop up in building and architectural practice in the 1880s. And there's a fuller elaboration of this divided labor in the construction of the Chicago Opera House in 1888. Specialization, bureaucratization, division of labor takes place in the academy as well. For the first time, really, in the history of higher education in the United States, it now becomes absolutely imperative to give each of the developing intellectual disciplines, particularly in the sciences, its own independent building. So, unlike antebellum colleges and universities, many of which had their different intellectual disciplines housed in a single building called the Old Manse, now we have whole campuses populated by buildings, each one of which is dedicated to a given discipline. So you see, a botany building, a zoology building, a physics building, a chemistry building at the University of Chicago, one of the first such instances of this sort of divided intellectual labor in the academy. This also leads to the need to plan campuses, and it's in the early and middle 1890s that you get the Trinity College plan upper left, the Stanford University plan upper right, Cobb's plan for the University of Chicago worked out between 1891 and 1893. McKim, and White's plan for Columbia University on Morningside Heights in New York. It's also during the 1880s that the social structure of the late 19th century metropolis becomes elaborated. And a good example of that is the first modern maturation of elite clubs. And Cobb is an architectural leader in this in America, particularly with the Union Club and the Chicago Athletic Association, and not too much later, the Onwensia Club, 1895. Part of the elaboration of social and professional life in the late 19th century metropolis also involves intensified, increased competitions among social groups. So, for example, the Union Club design resulted from a limited invited competition. Burnham and Root, a much more experienced firm, a much more experienced pair of architects than the very young Henry Ives Cobb, were part of that limited or invited competition. And you see Burnham and Root's design for the Calumet Club near Prairie Avenue on the right, but it was, of course, Cobb who won that competition. But there was a limited or invited competition for the design of the University of Chicago, for the design of the Federal Building, upper right, for the design of the Owings Building, lower right, and for the design of the Pennsylvania State Capitol. That was actually a national competition run in 1897. You may know that the design of this church was the result of a limited, invited competition that the firm of Cobb and Frost won on the basis of their design and on the basis of their budget. The building committee of the church was particularly fond of the economics of the Cobb and Frost proposal. This is a competition for the design of the Milwaukee City Hall that Cobb entered in 1893. Why he didn't win with this extraordinarily handsome building is beyond me. He took only second place. This is a competition he entered for the design of the Customs House in New York City, in Lower Manhattan, 1900. Cass Gilbert won that competition. But you can see this too is a very handsome building. The plan is extremely well worked out, in some ways better than Gilbert's plan, I think. In entering and winning the competition for the design of the Pennsylvania State Capitol, Cobb was attempting to expand his architectural base from the city of Chicago, the region of the Midwest, where he was already very well established. He wanted to secure a national reputation for himself. So one way to do that was to enter national architectural competitions. And national architectural competitions were really the product only of the late 1880s and early 1890s. So Cobbs was putting himself up against primo architects like McKim, Mead, and White, who had already designed the Rhode Island State Capitol that you see on the lower right, and Cass Gilbert, who'd already designed the Minnesota State Capitol on the lower left. In 1896, Cobb leaves Chicago. He, like a number of other individuals, Charles Tyson Yerkes and Bertha Palmer among them, sensed that Chicago's opportunities were drawing to a close and that there might be greater opportunities elsewhere. Cobb, having won the commission for the Federal Building to go up in Chicago, thought that perhaps Washington had greener pastures in terms of establishing a national reputation. So he moves there in 1896, and among other things, designs a campus plan and a set of buildings for the American University, a very interesting exercise in campus planning and design that unfortunately didn't come to much because finally there wasn't that much money behind the institution, not until after the First World War. He did design this manual training school, however, in the northwest corner of what is now the Shaw Historic District in northwest Washington, D.C. You see his perspective rendering above and the building is built below. Cobb also proposed a plan to redo the mall in Washington, D.C. before the mall before the mall that we know today. It was a very controversial plan for reasons I won't go into. I do go into them in the book. And it was the controversy that surrounded this plan of Cobb's that ignited the Macmillan Commission that hired Daniel Burnham, Charles McKim, and Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. to actually replan and redesign downtown Washington, D.C. So in some real historical sense, the mall in Washington we know today had as one of its instigators this controversial plan by Cobb. Washington turns out between 1896 and 1900 or so not to have undergone the building boom that Cobb was hoping for, so he transplanted himself to New York, where he already had lots of contacts through his father's family and through his wife's family. And there in the first decade of the 20th century, he becomes an exceptionally successful skyscraper architect. He has left Chicago, but Chicago has not left him. And we see that perhaps most vividly in the building on the right, the Liberty Tower, which was designed in exactly the sort of neo-Gothic style that Cobb used for the University of Chicago, that employed exactly the sort of white terracotta that had already been introduced onto office buildings by Burnham and Root's Reliance Building and D.H. Burnham and Company's Railway Exchange Building. But Cobb takes those things he had learned very well in Chicago, and he really develops a new kind of skyscraper design. He begins to accent the vertical in ways that were true of very few skyscrapers before this. And maybe in the photograph on the right, you can see more clearly how major and minor vertical lines run from the bottom to the top of the building to exaggerate or emphasize the building's poetic reach into the sky. And you can see him continuing here in New York the idea of the gable skyscraper that he pioneered in Chicago. It's also the case that the Liberty Tower, which Cobb designed in 1909, influenced in significant ways Cass Gilbert's design for the Woolworth Building, which Gilbert designed in its present form between 1910 and 1913. The use of white terracotta, for example. The emphasis on the vertical lines so that the building becomes this lofty, soaring sort of thing, to use Sullivan's adjectives. The use of a romantic crown or cap on the building may have also influenced Gilbert, particularly since Cobb's French chateau roof was laid up in copper sheets, as was Gilbert's copper crown on the Woolworth Building. These two postcard views contrast New York in 1905, top postcard, with New York in 1913, bottom postcard. And you can see just how much more romantic the skyline of lower Manhattan became as the result of these towered skyscrapers that emphasized the vertical and that terminated in eye-catching romantic crowns. So the Municipal Building, the Woolworth Building, Cobb's Liberty Tower is a kind of shoulder or buttress skyscraper to Ernst Flagg's Singer Building and the Bankers Trust Building. They're the principal actors in the romantic silhouette of lower Manhattan. And I spend the better part of chapter 12, the last chapter in the book, on what significance that shift from the prosaic nature of the skyline in 1905 to the romantic or poetic nature of the skyline in 1913. I examine what that had to do with radical shifts in people's perceptions of New York and the possibilities of skyscraper architecture. Maybe this would be a good time to pause. I brought along a set of slides that were intended to demonstrate Cobb's spatial sophistication. I'll give you just one example in this contrast between his plan for the Potter Palmer Mansion on the right, and H.H. Richardson's Glessner House on the left. The English architect, Richard Norman Shaw, had really developed something called the Central Hall Plan, and architects like Richardson and McKim imported it to America. So in the Glessner House, the Central Hall portion of the Central Hall Plan is right there. In Cobb's plan for Potter and Bertha Palmer's mansion, the Central Hall is actually more centrally placed than it often is in the Central Hall plan. More significantly, it's much larger. Just as significant, the connections between the hall and the morning room and the dining room and the parlor and the library have these very wide openings, so that there's not only a greater centrality to the position of the hall itself, there's a greater spatial fluidity and transparency among the spaces of the ground floor rooms than had previously been the case, with very few exceptions. Maybe another house by Richardson, one other shingle-style house by McKim. I'll stop there and open the floor to one or two questions before we move to more informal arrangements over in the chapel. Yes, sir.
Was the Union Building now, is it called the Union League Club?
The Union League Club was a different building from the Union Club designed by Cobb. Okay? Yes, sir. I couldn't give you a good answer to that question. I'm sorry? Well, lighting was, Edison had invented the light bulb in 1882, but it was a weak light bulb, 25 watts. So skyscraper developers were very careful, usually, at least in Class A office buildings, to maximize the amount of natural light that entered their buildings. So it was a combination of weak electric light and stronger natural light that made office space rentable to high-end tenants like doctors, lawyers, dentists, architects, and so forth. But on the heating of buildings, certainly there were radiator systems of heat in operation, but your question about the chimney is a good one. Exactly whether there were fireplaces in the Owings building or not, I couldn't tell you. Thanks for turning out in such generous numbers. It was a pleasure for me to be able to give this talk.
Couple of items. We want to thank the church for having us. It's a wonderful setting. And if you like what you heard today, we have other programs on a pretty consistent basis at House of the Four Winds last month. We encourage you to join in with our program. We'll have a nice holiday party coming up somewhere, not yet decided. Also, if you like what you heard tonight, Ted's book is available for sale. We have a limited number of copies. They'll be available over at the reception. Thank you very much.